As I often remark, this, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and its territories and possessions around the globe, is a great nation. It is the nation that more than any other can plausibly claim to be the nation that built the modern world. But it has screwed itself most comprehensively, so that according to the Bank of England, for whatever that's worth, we're now facing the longest recession since the 1920s. And if you think that it's just a question of taking the pain for another 6 months or so, well, by 2025, we will be the only developed nation whose economy has not returned to pre-pandemic levels. Right now, we have the sharpest decline in GDP in Europe. Let's take a look at this. Oh, that's us on the far left. Appropriately enough, we're at sub-basement level 9. And who's that over on the right soaring into the stratosphere with 3.2% growth? Oh, my word, that's those twinkling Irish charmers. If you're watching this in Dublin or Waterford or Shannon or Dundalk, and you have an idea as to why you've got 3.2% growth, and your old tyrannous masters are down in the basement, do drop me an email, gbviews@gbnews.uk, and tell me why, because we'd really like to know. Here's another graph from my old friends at The Spectator. Disposable income is set to fall further than at any time in the last 2/3 of a century, and by a lot more. See that deep red line over there? That's you. That's the economic context of today's autumn statement. In political terms, though, this statement is what usually happens when a new government takes office and wishes to correct the mistakes of its predecessor, as, say, Mrs. Thatcher's ministry did a few weeks in with Sir Geoffrey Howe's mini-budget of 1979, repudiating the failed Labour government of the previous years. Except, of course, in this case, Rishi Sunak's ministry is endeavouring to correct all the mistakes made by Rishi Sunak. It's very hard to pass yourself off as Nelson Mandela when you've been Hendrik Verwoerd for the entirety of your cabinet career. At any rate, you guys are poorer because of what he did in 2020, which is apparently too far back for anyone to remember. And now he's proposing to make you poorer still to correct what he did way back in 2020. You're paying the price for these guys' appalling screw-up. We'll get into this with David Starkey, but in a sane world, nobody who had anything to do with the last 3 years, nobody would be eligible for further public office. Unfortunately, that doesn't leave very many of our current political class. Westminster was divided between the lockdown party and the even more lockdown party. And if you're in the devolved nations, it's the even more lockdown party. But at the very least, we should require of the men who afflict us a public repudiation of what they've been doing. Instead, these sick, decadent wastrels are continuing exactly as before. You now have to bear the highest tax burden since the Second World War. But that was because we just fought the Second World War. So what's the excuse this time? Our Prime Minister back then was Winston Churchill. There he is. You remember him? The bloke who said, "We shall fight on the beaches." His grandson is a chap called Rupert Sones, who's the chief exec of Serco, and therefore has no desire to fight them on the beaches. Instead, he welcomes them to the beaches. 1,000 a night through the Border Force RNLI Express check-in, which is pretty sweet for Serco, because they have the contract to provide accommodation for quote-unquote asylum seekers, and that's just tuppenny-halfpenny stuff when it's a couple dozen asylum seekers here and there. But at 1,000 a night, that's a gangbusters business model. Serco also cleaned up on the COVID because they had the contract for the stupid waste of time contact tracing. So you can't say they're not a versatile company. COVID is track and trace. Open borders is no track, no trace. We'll get into a particularly shameful example of that with Leilani Dowding. But from Winston Churchill to Rupert Sones is the history of Britain in 3 generations of the same family, from we shall fight on the beaches to we shall welcome them on the beaches and say, come on down, and then we'll stick the British taxpayers with the tab. You're paying more taxes so that Winston Churchill's successor can pay Winston Churchill's grandson to put up every Albanian male under 53 in a country hotel. There's no point you putting up with the worst inflation in 40 years, the biggest drop in disposable income in 6.5 decades, and the highest tax burden in 3/4 of a century if this deranged government is just carrying on as usual. So when Granny's turning blue in February, and you've just noticed she hasn't moved in an hour and a quarter, it's worth remembering the cost of HMG's inability to solve the problems it's created. We'll get to it all tonight with David Starkey, Ava Valadingerbroek and Leilani Dowding. But we might as well start with the one place your money isn't being thrown away, and that would be the Blazing Donkey Hotel in Ham, which is near Sandwich in Kent. The owner has just turned down an offer from the Home Office of over £1 million to house a bunch of asylum seekers for the next year.